we need people to get better jobs, but in order to get better jobs, they need to be better qualified. In order to be better qualified, they need to go to school, but in order to go to better schools, we need to make the schools better. In order to make the schools better, they need to come from better households. In order to come from better households, we need to like, it's like a whole chain of like that has to be addressed.
Yeah, and a lot of it is just going to take generations.
Or maybe not necessarily generations, but if it wasn't generations, it would have to be like pushes in like 15 different areas, all working simultaneously, understanding that there's going to be a lot of friction. There's going to be a lot of initial sunk cost. There might not necessarily be improvements immediately. In some ways, things might get worse first. And that's like really hard, I think, for a lot of people to buy into.
Yeah, and China was responsible for the Equifax hack, right? Where they basically took every single American social security number, right? They're not going to go out and impersonate you or do any identity theft. What they're using it for is...
Do you, this is probably not, you agree that 15 and out, any kind of national minimum wage is probably pretty dumb if it applies to every single worker, I'm guessing, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess you could put it like to what it should be in the absolute lowest location if you wanted to have a national. So if like the cheapest place to live is like rural Montana, then you set that as like the national minimum wage, I guess.
Sure.
Yeah, the whole point of a minimum wage law that a lot of people don't understand is it's just to say like, hey, what's the lowest level we can have an employer pay an employee without 100% it being exploitative, right? And we even allow a lot of laws to get around the minimum wage. So an example of this is like, so for disabled individuals, you can pay a disabled individual less than minimum wage if, you know, their labor output isn't going to be that of like a full-time employee. Goodwill got in trouble for a lot of this. They were paying like their disabled employees significantly less than minimum wage, even though they were getting pretty similar or should have been paying them like a higher wage based on like what they were doing, right? We accept that it's okay to pay people below the minimum because there's other mechanisms for poverty prevention that we should have in place.
Yeah, wait, so here's a question that I've had on this. So some people would argue that like, sure, we can have them pay lower minimum wages, but okay. Let's say that in society, we have like a baseline level of benefits where you're guaranteed like a house, food, healthcare, clothes, like the basics are covered, right? A car, right? If you have that baseline, and then on top of that, you have like companies that pay wages, at a certain point, isn't every company just incentivized to pay like 1 cent an hour until like a certain wage? Because it's like, well, why the fuck should we pay them anything? Like their baseline is covered anyway.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is that you don't want to do that, I guess, because you want everybody, you want everybody to be working like whatever you think is fair. If it's like everyone has to work 40 hours a week or 50 or 60 or whatever, then that should be made up, I think, to whatever the minimum livable ends up being, right?
Gotcha. So then your goal for, if you were to design a minimum wage, your goal for the minimum wage should be that like anybody working a 40-hour week job should be making enough, including the benefits that the state is providing to live, to have like these minimum needs.
Well, it's basically that the person is like isn't getting exploited. Like you're not running some guy in basically a slave farm for like 1 cent an hour. Or whatever,
I don't like.
Right?
I try to stay away from that word exploited because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Because when you say exploitative, some people would say all wage labor, right? If we go Marxist, all wage labor is exploitative.
Well, I just don't engage with those people because there's no point.
But then on another hand, somebody would say that like there's no such thing as a bad wage. It's whatever somebody's willing to pay for it. So by definition, wages can't be exploitative because you've consensually entered into a contract.
I guess they can be, because we can go back to the example of the company towns, right? Where so this is like back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where there would basically be a mining town where the only employer in town was the mine, and then they would own all the stores and like all the housing and everything in that town. So they'd say you're going to get this wage, and it looks like a pretty good wage, but then they pay you in company dollars, and then just the fact of living just like literally leaves you in debt because the only place you can buy things is basically the company store with the company dollars, and no one wants that.
That's a more extreme example, right? That reminds me of was it Walmart or some other company that tried to pay people in like not gift cards, but in some type of card or whatever.
I want to say it was like McDonald's, and they gave them debit cards, I think, with money on it.
Yeah, so, and if you didn't use it all, they would start charging interest against it or whatever. Like it was some. It was.
Well, yeah, and they would charge you like a couple bucks a transaction and everything. Yeah, dude. I don't know if it was McDonald's.
I don't think it was McDonald's. It may be, but that sounds crazy if that was the case. But regardless of this, some people would argue that like, or hold on, I'm gonna stop saying that. I would argue, okay. So like, I would argue that like, we could talk about that being exploitative. Let's say that you take a city where somebody works in an area and they earn $10 an hour, and the only reason they're able to earn that money is because there's public transportation available. Let's say that you take that public transport available and the only jobs that they're within range of pay them $8 an hour. Is it exploitative that some people might be able to pay you a lower wage simply because you don't have the public transportation that allows you to get to higher paying jobs? Like, couldn't you consider that exploitative in that like your workers are literally only limited by, that's why I'm saying it feels like once you start saying some wages are exploitative, like, or what about people that are only making certain amounts because they can't move to another city or move to another part of the United States or whatever?
Yeah, well, let me get the economic definition of exploitative. I know there's one. I just don't remember it from my books.
Really, I'm sure
I can find it.
Because that feels like it would be less of an economic one and more of a, but maybe there is like an actual economic definition of exploitative, or under like our current like Keynesian models or whatever.
Like economics is like people, or I guess the big thing is just being able to define things for words that people intuitively understand, but in a way that everyone can think is fair, right? So there's definitions for utility, there's definitions for savings and things like that.
Well, even for like utility. Is there really a definition for utility? Isn't the definition for utility literally like there is no real definition for utility? Because it's like, it's such an abstract concept.
It's literally a unit of utility is the total satisfaction received from consuming a good or service, right? So you can compare utility levels in terms of like 5 utility is better than 4 utility, but there's no way to say how much better 5 is than 4. We just know 5 is better than 4, right?
Sure, so but then even so, like measuring that is almost like arbitrarily difficult. Like for instance, like the level of utility that somebody might get from consuming a certain good or service, that's going to vary from person to person, and even for a particular person, that might vary from point in their life to point in their life, and then even at a point in a life with a particular person, the same good or service might be different if it's consumed in like a different way, right? Like it seems like an incredibly
well, and then it's also really hard to tease out what people think is like their true utility for items, right? It's very difficult to actually
because sometimes people are just stupid and don't know. They'll answer questions incorrectly for why they like a particular thing or why they consume a particular thing, and they don't actually even understand why they like it.
Yeah, or they may, there's all sorts of things, especially when you're trying to design things around it. But we do have a definition, even if it's like really unsatisfactory.
Sure, okay.
Right?
Well, in that case, because what I'm worried about is like, if you give me a definition of like, well, what is exploitative wages? Well, exploitative wages are when wages are paid that are unfair. And it's like, okay, well, we're begging the question a little bit, sure, but.
So for, I guess, economic exploitation, I guess it's just traditionally used for like forced labor, right? So anything where I guess you would have some sort of coercive relationship.
For sure, like some kind of indentured servitude or something. Yeah, that could be, or like slavery, yeah. So like in our current economic system, maybe we can describe like prison labor as exploitative, right? Yeah,
but I think you're not really looking at it from like, you know, are we enslaving the prisoners, right? The question is, well, they have a debt to society, and if they can work a little bit to pay off that kind of debt,
that's why I said arguably, because you could make arguments one way or another, sure.
Yeah.
But other than that, so if that's like our economic definition, then almost no wage is paid in society, despite a person's inability to seek employment at other firms, is going to be considered exploitative, right?
Yeah.
But then obviously that's also like, that's very unsatisfactory from like an analysis of like, how do we improve society? Because there are going to be wages that are probably paid below what somebody should get, but since a company or firm knows they don't have the ability to, you know, move to another area to seek a different offer, it like inhibits their ability to negotiate, right?
Yeah, well, that's the other thing too, is like there are frictions and everything's like not perfectly seamless, right? You can only improve things like incrementally. You can never just have perfect control over everything at all times.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just, some of those things of like, well, I can just come up with some of these most extreme examples of like how, well, there's still a little bit of exploitation left. I don't think you're ever going to find anything that's ever going to do that, right? If you look at most of the stuff that we do with like physics and thermodynamics and everything, and even like designing like your cars and everything, well, we say, hey, we know that there's a bunch of errors. Here's like 50 assumptions we made like making your car, but you know what, that ends up being good enough. It passes our safety standards for, you know, 99.999% of the time. So that's just what we have to live with in all of our systems. And a lot of people just don't find that satisfactory, that you can't get everything exactly perfect. And they say, well, the cars work and the planes fly and whatever, and the engineers can do that. But they're making the same baseline kind of assumptions of like, you know what, once we hit this margin of error, well, is it really a problem anymore? And I guess that's unsatisfactory to a lot of people, but that's basically how the entire world works. It's just kind of bootstrapped together. And I think that's also why you see like big divisive debates over what's happening during like recessions, right? Well, should we interfere with the economy or not? So, I mean, you have like the Keynesian and then the, I guess, neo-Keynesian or post-Keynesian or whatever, and a lot of the other ones saying, yeah, we should have big government spending. And then on the other side, you have the Austrians saying, well, you know, the big government spending is actually causing all these bubbles and things of that nature. But the answer is kind of somewhere in between, right?
Sure.
Well, the economy may be better off 30 years down the road if we don't intervene, but like, shit, I'm going to be an old man by then, right? I don't want to starve in the streets between now and then, even if I'll have more money later on. And so the question then becomes of like, what trade-off are you willing to make? How much suffering are you willing to take today to have a better life in the future? And when you go to school and you get, you know, your debt, well, you're trading off a lot of your future to have something today. Or the same thing when you put things on your credit card and you don't pay it off for a couple of months, or when you go and buy your house and you get a loan, well, you are trading some of your future happiness for your happiness today.
Sure.
And that's a trade-off.
Economically, that's, you're talking about like time discounting kind of, right?
Well, yeah, it's basically like, when do you want to consume, right? And everyone has their own preferences. And so when you're doing this on a national scale, well, you have all sorts of people with all different time preferences of like what they would rather do, right? A lot of people are like, well, we need help now. And a lot of people are saying, well, dude, it's going to cost us all this money in the future. And at the end of the day, you're making one choice for every citizen.
Sure. I think that the disagreements in reality between people that vote, at least, is not quite that nuanced, but I can understand that from a higher level.
I don't think people should be voting on policies. I think people should be voting on outcomes, and then we should leave it to the people who actually know what's happening.
Yeah, that would be cool, but that would be a totally different way of...
Yeah. I totally agree.
Yeah, that's very frustrating to me. Well, the frustrating thing to me is that if people voted that way, I think that most Americans would be like 90% unified in terms of like what they actually wanted. Like, yeah. If we look at like healthcare, like I truly believe that most conservatives want all Americans to have access to healthcare. They just think that like the free market and being able to work and pay for your own is like the best way to provide that. I don't think most conservatives like think that like, oh, fuck Americans, they don't deserve healthcare, let them die in the streets. Like I don't think most of them truly believe that.
I think there's definitely some of them that are like, oh yeah, if you're like obese or a smoker or whatever, you're making these poor choices, like those need to be burdened with you, I would say. Like, and
sure, I'm sure there are some, but I think that the vast majority of Americans would be far united if we were looking at an outcome related thing. I think that most Americans want most other Americans to be like happy, healthy, take care of their family, send their kids to school. I think that most Americans are united on that front.
Yeah, I think a big thing too is a lot of the individual issues we look at, they don't see the broader picture of like, well, in order to fix this, well, there's like 80 fixes that need to go on. They just hammer like this fix, this fix, this fix, and we can get this done, and then it messes up like so many other things. And now they're saying, oh, well, this is now a problem because we did this fix, and it probably was the right thing to do in the long run, but because we don't have the rest of the system in place, it just like tears itself apart, right?
Yeah, that's the most annoying thing when it comes to like jobs or anything. There's a whole chain of like, we need people to get better jobs, but in order to get better jobs, they need to be better qualified. In order to be better qualified, they need to go to school, but in order to go to better schools, we need to make the schools better. In order to make the schools better, they need to come from better households. In order to come from better households, we need to like, it's like a whole chain of like shit that has to be addressed.
Yeah, and a lot of it is just going to take generations, right?
Unfortunately.
Like, that's an answer that people just don't want to like. I mean,
or maybe not necessarily generations, but if it wasn't generations, it would have to be like pushes in like 15 different areas, all working simultaneously, understanding that there's going to be a lot of friction, there's going to be a lot of initial sunk cost. There might not necessarily be improvements immediately. In some ways, things might get worse first, and that's like really hard, I think, for a lot of people to buy into.
Yeah, and I mean, for education, right? If you're investing in like a kid going to pre-K, well, that's not paying out for at least a decade and a half, right? Maybe 2 decades before you start seeing those returns. And then those returns are like paid out over that guy's working
lifetime.
So
Yeah.
So these are really bad numbers, and these are from old studies, but basically for every dollar that we're putting in education, we're getting something like 20 to 30, like, or for like pre-K education, we're getting like 20 to $30 back in time adjusted dollars and taxes from all these things, right? Same thing with like a lot of the basic science things. Like for every dollar, we get between $4 and $20 back in taxes over the next like 2 or 3 decades. The problem is a lot of these things like aren't profitable now, and there's a lot of emphasis on making sure the budget is like balanced every year, instead of over like cycles, right? And that's kind of problematic. Well, they say, well, you're deficit spending now, so we can deficit spend now, so that's good. There's like a concept of like a full employment budget of basically how much would you spend if the economy was fully employed, and like that's kind of what it should be. And so when the economy is fully employed, and you're spending that much, well, you should be taking a little bit of money in. And when the economy is not fully employed, well, you should be borrowing. The government can borrow at really, really low rates, and that's fine.
Which is funny because in 2 other levels of finance, we understand this as well. For instance, when it comes to individuals, we finance our working capabilities by taking a ton of debt to go to school before increasing our earning potentials later in life. And then on a corporate level, we finance with a fuck ton of debt until a company has reached a certain scale before we say like, okay, well now it's time to make money. But for some reason, when it comes to what?
That's not always been the case with businesses, right? It's been focused on like turning a profit first and then kind of expanding. There's
sure, but that trend
has really changed that.
Yeah, or at least in the past like 10 or 15 years, that trend seems to be like very different. That you want to take on.
It's super profitable if you can get in on the beginning, because basically you pass off the risk to all of your investors. Well, if it goes bankrupt, well, it's not a problem because you've already made tens or hundreds of millions of dollars.
Sure,
it doesn't really matter to you. And I think that's kind of problematic, and you can't really run a country that way in terms of like, well, if we just spend too much, we end up bankrupt. Like that's not really something that we think we should take with like the leader of the free world, or what should be the leader of the free world.
Sure.
Because I mean, if a company goes bankrupt, yeah, there's a few thousand people looking for jobs, but like, let's say the US goes like bankrupt, right? And we tear ourselves apart and we have to form a new government. Well, where does that leave the rest of the world in terms of
the rest of the
integration?
world is fucked, yeah, of course.
Yeah, and then where does it leave us in terms of authoritarianism, right? Like, not to play like up like maybe all the threats, but like if China or Russia was leading the world, I don't think we would be
we wouldn't have a place at the table
as we could be.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think a lot of it is like kind of scary because we've kind of seen it grow up under our noses. I think that was the one thing that Trump was like accidentally right on, was being tough on China.
I think that like being tough on China, I think involves more than just like tariffing them a little bit, right? Like I think it feels like you need a lot of different countries to pressure an entity like that, and you need a lot of really strong relationships to apply like good pressure on that.
Yeah, if you have unilateral sanctions, they're very ineffective, and 2, it hurts yourself just as much as it hurts the other guy. And when we're 2 comparable economies, right, it's really no skin off their back, because again, China's an authoritarian state. If anyone dissents with what the state's doing, well, they're just going to get disappeared, right? Where in the United States,
democracies can't sustain that much like unpopularity over that long period of time.
But only during like periods of war, right? Where there's really something to rally everything around. No one's really too worried about the cyber intrusions happening, because like that doesn't affect them on a day-to-day life, right? They're not too worried. They're like, oh man, these big corporations had their secrets stolen. Well, good, fuck those corporations, right? That's basically the rhetoric that's coming out, and it doesn't affect people really the same way that it would be if they're saying, all right, well, you know, they bombed an American factory and did $10 billion of damage to like Pennzoil or whatever, right? It's not the same, and we can't sustain it, and that's problematic.
Yeah, and the cyber shit is like a pretty big deal. Like, it's like very untalked about. A lot of people are very unprotected against it, and there's like a lot of damage that goes on relating to that.
Yeah, well, so China was responsible for the Equifax hack, right? Where they basically took every single American social security number, right? They're not going to go out and impersonate you or do any identity theft. What they're using it for is to just monitor what everyone is doing, and then they can use that to find patterns of behavior. So they can identify like, all right, well, these guys are working for like the FBI. These guys are like whatever.
Can they compromise or whatever? Yeah.
Yeah.
And then same thing with they were behind the SF-86 hack too, weren't they?
I believe so. I know the SF-86 was hacked. I'm not sure if it's them or Russia, but yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if there was some sort of intelligence sharing between the two. But then it doesn't even matter anymore because no one gives a shit about solar winds. That's the biggest fucking disaster that we've had. Like, that basically, imagine if you had a spy in in the senior levels of every single US agency. That's effectively what SolarWinds was. They were able to read every single communication between every single department. They were looking at everything that was done in the Treasury. They were looking at everything that was being done in the Federal Reserve. They were looking at all sorts of flows and payments to all sorts of vendors. They literally saw everything. It's like if we caught like 1,000 Russian spies all at once, there would be calls for blood in the streets to bomb Moscow, right? So why aren't we seeing that same level of response? And they've there's kind of in this pattern of non-escalation from the cyber domain into like the real domain.
Yeah, because
right?
it seems unreal. It seems like a different like thing. Like, who cares? It's just computer shit. Yeah.
Well, because we just haven't had a response doctrine, right? So for the United States, like Army, well, if the Russian Air Force fighters come within X, then you scramble fighters. If they come within this distance, then like you start like warning, and then if they come within this distance, then like you shoot them, right? So we have very clear like rules of escalation.
The problem is, how do you even begin to do that for cyber-related stuff?
Yeah, exactly, and we haven't really had those policies and procedures. Trump did another okay thing in creating the Space Force, which is essentially Cyber Command and splitting that out to its own thing. But again, I think it's just tangential rightness rather than him like seeing into the future. I'm sure this was brewing under Obama as well. But that's something that we need to have something very clear. We did get some of that with NATO, but I mean, NATO now has a cyber command. I think we made that in 2020, but we're just starting to do that. But I think a lot of these things are very damaging to our economy, and we're just not really realizing it. I guess another thing, reliance. Interreliance of of a lot of countries is starting to become very important in terms of getting people to do the things that we need. At least with Russia, they're so reliant on like natural gas exports to Europe that it's been pretty good, I guess, economically keeping them relatively tame, I should say. But then at the same time, they basically have like a noose around Europe's neck, right? They're not energy independent. I think they get about a third of their energy from Russia. So where does that leave like their economy, right? And it just feels like we're just losing out on a lot of influence that we otherwise could be having because we just haven't progressed in technology.
Are we increasing the amount of exports that we've been doing for oil to Europe?
Yeah, but you can't really send LNG over like tankers. It's just not energy efficient. It's incredibly expensive to keep it cold enough to be compressed enough to be worthwhile.
And we don't have. You can't build like pipelines for that stuff, or?
Well, you can, but you can't build pipelines across the oceans, right?
Why not? Is it just way too much?
It's far too expensive. It's like the easiest. Yeah, it's just way too expensive. It would be so vulnerable as well, right? So like, let's say we got into a war with Russia. Well, how many hundreds of thousands of
miles of pipeline would you have to defend or anything like that?
Yeah, and all you need is one sub to just like go down there, one torpedo dropped off of a drone. Like, it would be relative. Yeah, it's just. Yeah, it's kind of unfeasible and it's uneconomical. No one wants to put out the cost for like a nuclear reactor because of how long it's going to take to start paying back, and to be the same thing with those pipelines.
People are saying Turkey's trying to do that in the Mediterranean. Yeah, but that's a far less distance, probably not as deep to cover as well, I would imagine.
Yeah.
And a much easier area to defend.
Yeah. Oh, and I guess that's the other thing too. Like all the other dictators that are kind of rising up, like Turkey, I guess. I'm not sure, but we need Turkey because it basically controls access to the Black Sea, and it's on the south side of Russia, so there's a place that we can theoretically shoot missiles at them, and that's just that much more land they have to defend.
Where does the support come from for the war on drugs right now? Is it just old people, or when does the DEA shit change?
So I think one of the big things when people talk about the war on drugs is there's a lot of like really bad downstream effects that are it's really complicated because there's so much environmental damage being done by a lot of these narcos. There is a lot of damage that are being done to communities. it's not good. But yeah, I would say it's mostly conservatives, but and there's like pretty good rationale for that, right? There's people getting murdered all throughout the Central and South America from this. So even if like an end user, it may not be that harmful for them for a lot of these, the money that flows through down across the border is pretty bad. And because we're not in a position where we can just like legalize or decriminalize a lot of these drugs,
well,
it seems like the best thing to do.
I mean, like these things would go hand in hand, of course, right? Like if you were to talk about like ending the war on drugs, yeah, it would have to come alongside the legalization of this shit as well, right?
Yeah, but the question is like, should we be allowing people the decision to like massively harm themselves and others, right? I mean, if you look at our right to drink alcohol, for every, I want to say it's like every 12,000 people that have a right to drink alcohol, well then, you know, someone dies in a DUI accident, right? So there are trade-offs that are being made, and yeah, it's a question that we kind of have to have as a society. And I think there's a lot of people on the right who says, no, we need to stop people from harming themselves with these illicit substances. Right?
So while I agree with that morally, this is a very unsatisfying thing to say morally, but I think that at some point, I think you do have to look pragmatically at what's going on. So for instance, like maybe there's something that's pretty harmful, but if it's actually fucking impossible to get people not to do it, maybe at some point you got to be like, okay, yeah, fuck it. Like when we tried to like
the
with
other moral answer then comes to, well, why aren't we intervening in Central and South America, right? We're America. We could just go blow up all those cartels, but it's because we respect the sovereignty of a lot of these like partners in the regions, right?
Well, wait, I think it's because why would we do that?
Why would we go kill off all the narco traffickers?
Yeah.
Like in order to stop that, right?
Well, why we don't have an interest in those countries, right? Generally in South America right now?
I mean, we don't, but if we really wanted to, I guess, stop this, like, I guess, overall moral harm, sure, we would have to go down there. But if we have no interest in, like, what happens down there, then, yeah, it wouldn't be a problem, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, because I don't think that the U.S. would generally intervene just on the better of a country if they're trying to help people, right? Usually there needs to be some secondary interest or primary interest even for us involved,
yeah,
right?
well, I mean, yeah, there has to be secondary interest in everything, but for the most part, it seems like a lot of the world wants America to intervene when there's like definite moral wrongs happening, like Darfur or North and South Sudan or Somalia or Bosnia. Yeah, but at the same time, when we intervene in other places and it goes bad, they'd like to blame us for it. So like Iraq is a pretty good example of us shitting the bed and the world getting really mad about that intervention. And to a certain extent, the Iraq war is a little bit justifiable, or was a little bit justifiable. Obviously, the prosecution was like horrendous.
When you say the Iraqi war was justifiable, this is what you're really saying is he should have been kicked out after the first Gulf War, right?
Well, no, and that we should have actually intervened in 2003. There is a very strong case for it. So he was continuing to maintain his chemical munitions programs. He had acquired dual-use technology from France. He was spending a lot of money to keep the technical know-how to produce a lot of these WMDs around, and he was actively trying to avoid sanctions in order to get more chemical weapons. Or get the precursors and everything to create it. So, and he had the intent and the willingness to do it before. He had literally genocided like thousands and thousands of Kurds. He openly used these chemical weapons against Iran, and it appeared as if he was going again to get these chemical weapons. So that is a justifiable reason, I think.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to justify going in after leaving him there after the first time. Like, what did we really expect was going to happen, right?
Well, I guess the thought was after leaving him in the first time, there would be a power vacuum, and then he would stop going like down the road to these programs, right? Obviously, the PR campaign of like, well, we don't want the warning to be like a mushroom cloud. Well, that's kind of insanity. I don't think anyone actually thought Iran or Iraq was capable of putting together that type of WMD. So, yeah.
Real quick, hold on, because this gets argued about before on stream. Is it still thought that like you can't enrich uranium secretly right now? Can you?
No, not anymore, because we have a lot of really good satellites and sensors and stuff. Back then, I don't know how the technology is, but when you're doing a lot of the enrichment process, well, Let me think.
You need, like, my understanding, because there was a nuclear guy that emailed me a while ago, and the way that he phrased it was that as of current technology, without like future space shit, like you can't get around the massive number of massive centrifuges that you need to produce this stuff. You can't just build it underground.
You
or something.
could theoretically do it, but you would need like a multi-decade long project to build like secret manufacturing plants, and then those secret manufacturing plants, like you can't have like the satellites tracking the things coming in and out,
and
so
nothing can get
nice
leaked at an Intel level or anything.
Yeah, so like you could do it, but it would be dramatically difficult to do. Yeah. Obviously, like we totally shit the bed in Iraq and everything else, but people say like, well, we shouldn't intervene. But at the same time, again, looking back at all those other examples, people want us to. They just want us to be right. And I don't think you're ever going to be in a position where you're going to be right all the time, and then it's going to be used against you as propaganda.
Sure.
Because that's kind of, I mean, the easiest way is to say, look at the American failure in Iraq. Because it was.
Sure.
I appreciate you having me on, and thanks for the shout out. I literally doubled my Twitch channel and got like 50 subs and shit, so
damn,
really appreciate it.
Okay. Yep. Well, hey, have fun, be careful, stay safe. Rip on, my dude.
All right, sounds good. Take care. Bye.
Yep. Fucking nerd. Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed.
Hey Destiny, I've been thinking a lot about the ocean lately. It even made me wonder how hot the sun is.
What?